Right, so it's noon, so we'll go ahead and get started. Hey everyone, and welcome to the Cyberspace Solarium Commission staff event on cybersecurity lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you everyone for joining us today for our staff rollout of this white paper, which is available on our website. Before we get started, I want to remind everyone to please use the Q&A function in the bottom right corner of your screen to ask any questions. Don't use the chat function. Our panelists are going through the Q&A function to answer any of your questions. Please also limit your comments in the Q&A to only questions. If you have comments that you'd like to share with us, you can send them to info@solarium.gov rather than typing them in the Q&A. This event is being recorded and will be made available on our website at www.solarium.gov tomorrow. So without further ado, Mark, why don't you go ahead and kick us off?
Hey, thank you very much, Diane, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Mark Montgomery, the Executive Director of the Commission. Welcome to the 8th of our CSE Digital Discussion Series, where my senior staff will spend about an hour diving into the details of and answering questions on a specific issue from the Commission's report strategy. I'm kind of excited. This is not from the original report. Today, we're going to discuss components from the white paper we released yesterday, titled, and our first white paper titled Cybersecurity Lessons from the Pandemic. Previously, we called it the Pandemic Annex, but this white paper looks at the fact that the COVID-19 pandemic is really challenging our resilience on a national scale. And it illustrates for all of us the challenges with building and maintaining resilience in a modern connected world. And the lessons the country's learning from this ongoing non-traditional national emergency, while they're not perfectly analogous to significant cyber attack, they can really offer some illuminating parallels. So what happened was the two chairmen, Senator King and Representative Gallagher, sensing that the staff wasn't working hard enough, said, hey, let's get in there and do a white paper on our collected observations from the pandemic as it relates to security in cyberspace. So they said, look, first, take a look at what we get right in this, in our 82 recommendations, which are validated by this. We had this similar non-traditional national security event. What can we learn from this that says, hey, you really had this right? But they also said, wait a minute, let's also figure out what we didn't, where our gaps were, where we were missing things. So also take a look at what's unique in this, because you didn't visualize the pandemic type of existence. What now, having seen it, do you understand is necessary? So really, what can it teach the United States about how to prepare for a major cyber disruption? As a result, I think we found that the pandemic does highlight the importance of many of our existing recommendations. One of my favorites, the National Cyber Director, and really the one I think is the most critical, the idea of developing an ability to conduct continuity economy planning. And we're really seeing that on a macro scale here. As we had to shut down the economy and then restart it. And these are shutting down and restarts at our own leisure, at our own pace. What we think about in a cyber event is a prompt drop of the economy, and how do we respond? How do we do initial incident response? How to do recovery? So I think there's a lot of opportunity here to learn. And then also, what does it tell us about our recommendations on the uptake of secure cloud services and some other security of the ecosystem recommendations? So that was kind of the whole, what did it teach us about what we thought? Then, in that second area, I talked about what kind of new recommendations that it offer us in light of the gaps we identified. And, we did identify gaps or failures on our part previously to think with enough aperture. And really, we hadn't thought about what happens when the final mile of workplace is put in the home. In other words, we entrust the security of our businesses and even government proprietary information to the devices in our homes. What's that mean for us? And what does this tell us? What recommendations do we need to talk about with terms of the IT modernization of our state and local critical services? As we saw these stressed heavily, what do we really need to do with IT modernization, and what's the role of IT security support in that? And then finally, what's our vulnerability to disinformation operations conducted during an ongoing crisis? Because clearly that's occurred, and our recommendations were not really looking at the kind of what happens when you do one on top of the other. So we're going to go through those new recommendations with some specificity today. All right, with that as set up for me, let me introduce my colleagues who will join in explaining our white paper. First, I'm really proud to have Robert Morgus on here. He's the Director of Research and Analysis on Task Force 2. But most importantly, he was the principal writer of the white paper. And I think he did a good job. It's for you to judge. With him, we have Val Cofield, our Senior Director and Lead for Task Force 3, and Laura Bate, our Director for Cyber Engagement. I think you've seen all three of these staffers before, senior staffers before, in one of the previous 7 events. So I know you know how to work with them. And I know you know how this works because to give you time to get your questions in, I'm going to go ahead and kick it off with 6 or 7 basic ones. From my observation of the building of this white paper, what I saw, I'll get it started, and then I hope you'll jump in with a lot of good questions. So Rob, go ahead and provide kind of a brief overview of the document, how it's organized, and what you would flag, from your experience as the lead writer, the key findings in the paper.
Sure, thanks, Mark. And I think, Mark, you already touched on a decent number of the sort of key findings in the overview. So I just want to jump right in and say the main point here is that the COVID-19 pandemic has challenged our resilience on a national scale and illustrates those challenges. The annex itself highlights 32 of the Commission's original recommendations while modifying 2 of them, which we'll talk about in greater detail today. And in addition, we propose 4 new recommendations in light of the circumstances surrounding the pandemic, as Mark already teased. The annex itself is divided into 2 sections. The first section looks at cybersecurity challenges during a pandemic, and that focuses really on recommendations that were made more pressing by the pandemic response and the associated social distancing protocols. We're going to talk about all of those in detail today. Section 2 focuses more on what the pandemic can teach us about our readiness for a significant cyber incident. And it focuses on recommendations that the COVID-19 crisis has reinforced as urgent to ensure that the U.S. is well positioned to prevent and respond to a crisis. I want to pause for a second on that section and highlight the 2 recommendations, and Mark already teased them, that I think we found were sort of most urgent and most pressing given the pandemic and what it tells us about cybersecurity. The first is the National Cyber Director recommendation, which Mark already teased. In confronting COVID-19 and other catastrophes, it's become imperative or increasingly clear that the executive branch needs to be guided by strong leadership, including subject matter experts who are sufficiently empowered to coordinate, plan, prepare for a crisis response well ahead of the actual event itself. I mean, you look at the important roles played by Dr. Fauci and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and I think that really underscores the importance of strong leadership in the White House. So I would say, given these realities, the recommendation for a national cyber director, which would act as a principal advisor for the president on cybersecurity and emerging technology issues, is all the more important. The second big recommendation that I want to highlight from Section 2 is the continuity of the economy recommendation. The shocks to the economy, particularly national production, distribution, and logistics caused by the coronavirus outbreak, call attention to the complexity of our economy and the interconnectedness of the economy and supply chains. Both are potential points of fragility. While the Commission approached the issue of continuity of the economy from the perspective of sort of a cyber disruption, I think the continuity of the economy recommendation is broader than that, and we really do need to plan for disruptions no matter their cause. To do so, the federal government should develop a plan, and this is just underscoring what we said in the initial report, taking into account state, local, and private sector equities, which we've seen are incredibly important during a crisis. The continuity of the economy plan must ensure that the U.S. government can maintain coordinated action with key partners in times of crisis. As the pandemic has demonstrated, disruptions to key companies and functions have downstream effects that can actually limit our ability to respond to a crisis. And in the context of the pandemic, this has meant scrambling for or redirecting production to produce protective equipment and medical supplies. In the context of massive cyber disruption, it could mean ensuring the availability of the right high-tech equipment to reconstitute key networks and processes. It could mean ensuring that we have the capacity, the human capacity, to conduct robust incident response. I would just say the bottom line from the pandemic annex and sort of the learnings that we glommed from looking at the pandemic and through the sort of lens of cybersecurity is this. The United States has experienced a number of wake-up calls in cybersecurity. In 2014, we watched as China breached OPM. In 2015 and 2016, we watched as Russian intelligence operatives shut off the power grid in Ukraine. In 2017, the rise of ransomware in the form of WannaCry and NotPetya further reinstilled sort of the fragility of our systems. And yet we haven't really taken the steps needed to really invest in resiliency, to really invest in cybersecurity across the nation. Now in 2020, we're experiencing firsthand what a major disruption to our economy and day-to-day life looks like in the form of the coronavirus. Like I said, the alarm bell for cybersecurity has been ringing for the better part of the last decade, maybe 2 decades, signaling the need for the US to invest meaningfully to build better resilience, but we've continually reached for the snooze button. I think, the pandemic provides yet another wake-up call, and now is really the time for us to wake up, smell the coffee, heed the lessons, and actually invest.
All right, thanks. That's a great discussion of what it said about our previous report. And just pick up, I know I mentioned these, but you probably know a lot better detail than I do. What the pandemic, as the pandemic created, new economic realities like the digitization of critical services or the exposure of the challenges there and the creation of a work from home economy. What lessons did you draw from that? And what were the implications for cybersecurity?
Yeah, so 2 big points there. One is the digitization of critical services, and the second is the work from home aspect of things. So during the outbreak, Americans have increasingly relied on federal and state programs whose legacy systems have been stressed to the brink of failure. You think about sort of unemployment benefits, you think about welfare benefits and the like. Social distancing has pushed the need for these benefits and these delivery of services, which are in some cases run by state and local governments, but also in some cases run by small and medium-sized businesses. They pushed the envelope and the need for those to be digitized to survive future pandemics or a catastrophic cyber incident, for example. We need secure remote access to reliable remote services. We therefore took a look at our existing recommendations that might play into this sort of theme, and recommendation 4.5.1 from the initial report talks about expanding the uptake of secure cloud services. We decided to sort of do a small modification on that recommendation to call on Congress to include grants to SLTT governments in future COVID-19 stimulus legislation so that these entities can more quickly move to the cloud and modernize their digital infrastructure in order to provide more secure and reliable remote services. The way we envision this working is in really 2 phases of grants. The first tranche of grants would come in the form of an immediate block grant to states based largely on population size and be pointed toward the procurement of email solutions, of productivity tools, of cybersecurity solutions, services and tools, customer relationship management tools, and the like. That would be dispersed immediately and sort of for immediate investment. The second tranche would be made available to states, local, tribal, and territorial governments on an ongoing basis for 5 years on a competitive basis, where those state, local, tribal, and territorial governments would come to the grants administrator, which would likely be FEMA and CISA, produce a project proposal that would be judged based on its merits for digitization of critical services. These grants would fund projects like projects to procure technologies or services that enable the remote delivery of critical government services like emergency services and government benefit and entitlement services. So that's the digitization aspect of it. Then on the other hand, we saw the sort of work from home aspect of it, right? So the pandemic has pushed all of us to work from home, as we can see. In this setting, enterprise IT security teams are less effective, right? They have less control over the nodes in their network, right? I'm using a personal device, actually not a personal device. I'm using a work device to log into this, but I have a personal device that I'm also using, but all of it's relying on my home router, no longer on a business router, right? As we note in the white paper, as internet traffic surges by 30 to 50% during the pandemic, consumer devices and networks provide an easier target and a larger target and attack surface for our adversaries. This reality highlights the importance of many of the recommendations in the ecosystem pillar of the initial report, like establishing a national cybersecurity certification and labeling authority to help consumers purchase more secure devices, asking ISPs and content delivery networks to develop a strategy to secure foundational internet protocols and the like. But it also exposes a key vulnerability that we didn't really touch on, and that's one that I just mentioned, and that is of home devices, home IoT devices, routers, and the like. To plug this gap, we actually have a new recommendation that proposes a new IoT security law to ensure that manufacturers of IoT devices build in basic security into the devices that they produce and put and sell in the US. We wanted to be minimally prescriptive when we talked about this, so we really went for sort of real baseline requirements or recommendations for requirements, things like ensuring that you have unique authentication built in by default, and asking that when an IoT device first gets connected to the network, the user has to enter a new authentication username and password, and also ensuring that devices are patchable, right? You don't have to actually make them remotely patchable, but you need to make sure that they have patchability. That sort of covers the broad swath of, I would say, the work from home economy recommendations, Mark.
Thanks, Rob. That was a mouthful. So we'll take a break there from Rob, go to Val, and I should have mentioned at the beginning that Val Cofield's our senior detailee from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, done a fantastic job here. Val, we've seen over the past 2.5 months a rise in a reporting of a rise in opportunistic cybercrime. What did the white paper have to say about how to prevent and mitigate this activity from occurring?
Thanks for that question, Mark. And before I start, I just wanted to recognize that I know this is a difficult time to be discussing issues around law enforcement. Though the current law enforcement challenges the nation is facing right now are not within the remit of the Commission, cyber issues are interconnected. And as we discuss cybercrime, as the Commission discusses cybercrime, we're responding to the increase and particularly egregious hacks against healthcare infrastructure and attempts at fraud that have taken advantage of a really challenging time. And as we discuss these topics, we know that this is all taking place against a backdrop of a national conversation about how we conduct law enforcement in the US, the federal government's role in protecting the population during a pandemic, and many other really difficult issues. With that context in mind, our recommendations strive to strengthen norms protecting healthcare and to protect Americans from criminals and bad actors taking advantage of the present moment. Malign cyber actors are targeting the healthcare sector, spreading mis and disinformation, and taking advantage of these uncertain times with various fraudulent schemes. Cyber-specific nonprofits regularly collaborate with law enforcement in writing cybercrime reports, assisting with law enforcement operations, and providing support to victims. The COVID-19 pandemic has proven that trusted nonprofit organizations serve as critical law enforcement partners that can quickly mobilize to help identify and dismantle major online schemes. One such example of these nonprofits is the National Cyber Forensic and Training Alliance that recently assisted in a public and private effort to disrupt hundreds of COVID-19 related scams. This effort included dismantling a website that falsely sought donations to the American Red Cross, sites that purportedly linked to government programs, and other schemes that compromised legitimate corporate websites to distribute malware to unsuspecting visitors. Such nonprofits have the expertise and flexibility to help and reinforce law enforcement's efforts to disrupt cybercrime and assist victims. However, they often face financial challenges. Therefore, the Commission recommended in the pandemic white paper that Congress provide grants through the Department of Justice's Office of Justice Programs to help fund these essential efforts. The rise in cybercrime that we've seen during the pandemic also highlighted the Commission's recommendation to strengthen the FBI's cyber mission and the National Cyber Investigative Joint Task Force, or NCIJTF. Strengthening the FBI's mission and the NCIJTF would provide federal law enforcement with enhanced personnel and resources to conduct and coordinate actions that raise costs and impose consequences on cyber threat actors.
Sorry about that small problem with my mute button there. So Val, I want to follow up on that a little bit. So understanding that's the opportunistic cybercrime domestically, what's the pandemic taught us about the role of international allies and partners and preventing and responding to these attacks? And what should we do about working with allies and partners? Let's say it differently. What's already working with allies and partners, and what might we be able to strengthen there?
Thanks for that question. So the pandemic has taught us that working with allies and partners is even more important than ever. We need to work together to strengthen our cyber norms against attacking critical infrastructure and protecting innocent victims from cybercrime. During the pandemic, when the healthcare and public health sectors were particularly strained, we've seen healthcare infrastructure in the United States and abroad suffering from cyber attacks. Malign actors have been capitalizing upon and exacerbating the difficulties of the pandemic by hacking hospitals, stealing vaccine research, spreading COVID-19 mis and disinformation, and crafting COVID-related malicious phishing emails, which we've seen a 600% increase of. So in terms of what's working, though, with allies and partners, we have conducted many successful transnational cybercrime operations like the Avalanche and Gosnim cyber criminal network takedowns. The Avalanche network had more than 24 of the world's most pernicious types of malicious software and many different money laundering schemes on it. And the operation was a coordinated effort of 40 jurisdictions, including India, Singapore, Taiwan, and Ukraine. A complex transnational organized crime network used the Gosnim malware in an attempt to steal an estimated $100 million from the United States and around the world. This operation highlighted an unprecedented initiation of criminal prosecutions against members of the network in 4 different countries as a result of cooperation between the United States, Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, Germany, Bulgaria, Europol, and Eurojust. As stated by U.S. Attorney Scott Brady, who prosecuted that case, international law enforcement has recognized that the only way to truly disrupt and defeat transnational anonymized networks is to do so in partnerships. So in terms of what we need to strengthen, though, we need to work better with allies and partners to respond to these attacks. And as such, the U.S. should establish an assistant secretary over the new Bureau of Cyberspace Security and Emerging Technology at State Department. This assistant secretary will be able to facilitate collective action between the U.S. and partners and collaborate with the international community to collectively attribute and punish violators of norms, especially those against the healthcare and public health sector.
Thanks. And you remind me that when we were researching this, there's a good primer on the international law enforcement and ways for reforming it on Third Way on their website on catching the cyber criminal. So good. I think there's a lot of work going on there, and we had some recommendations. All right. Well, Laura is here. Laura Bay, who's our real workforce expert. She does a lot of things, but one of her primary ones is a workforce. The white paper did highlight the importance of developing a solid cyber workforce. Of course, you need to do that before the crisis, whether it's a pandemic or cyber one. And we did end up offering up some slight modifications on our recommendations based on what we saw in the pandemic. Can you walk us through what was in there and why the commission wanted to highlight these kind of nuances or these new changes?
Yeah, absolutely. Given the present moment with millions of people unemployed, and on the other hand, tens of thousands of jobs open in cybersecurity in the public sector and hundreds of thousands more generally across the economy in the United States, we looked at this and said, let's make a virtue out of a necessity here and figure out opportunities to connect these unemployed workers with the jobs that we really need to fill in cybersecurity so that we are, like you said, Mark, prepared for the next cybersecurity emergency. As I say that, I want to be careful not to overpromise because building cybersecurity professionals really takes time. You're not going to put someone through a quick month or 2 training and have them hit the road running as a cybersecurity professional, cybersecurity expert. It takes years to build the kind of experience that you need to do that. However, this is a particularly good moment to start with some of that investment into training. It's also increasingly clear, and has been for a couple of years, that employers really need to step up and be proactive in helping to build alternative pathways into the cybersecurity workforce, and to find opportunities to take junior employees and provide them with the experience they need to become mid-career professionals, to create these pathways to get people into the workforce. In the United States government, that really starts with recognizing that we're not going to hire the mid-career professionals we want, at least not at the scale that we need. We do need to fill those experienced mid-career jobs. However, it doesn't economically work, it doesn't practically work to go out and try to seek those people out. So what we recommend is to figure out opportunities to bring in early career professionals and really provide them with the experience they need to begin over time to fill those roles and to start now with that process. In order to build those systems, there are a certain number of things that we need. For one, we need direct hire authorities. In many cases, these exist in the federal government and just aren't used as robustly as you'd like to see. In other cases, they don't exist. We also need HR offices that really know how to use those authorities where they exist and that know how to work in concert with the subject matter experts that are looking to fill these work roles. We also need to figure out how to reward mentorship within the federal government. If we're bringing in junior employees and training them up with the experience they need to become mid-career and senior employees, we need to make sure that their coworkers, that their peers who are around them, who are helping them gain that experience, are rewarded for being part of that training and mentorship process. And finally, we need to think creatively about how we adapt these pathways and how we adapt these systems to really tap into diverse pools of talent. We need that diversity of perspective to make the strongest teams we can on the federal cyber workforce. And the present moment can really be a good catalyst for doing that.
So with that in mind, we had already identified a number of different workforce development models in our report. A lot were in circulation. I think you and I have had the disappointing discussion of reading a 2010 cybersecurity workforce report, reading a 2015 workforce report, and then reading the cybersecurity workforce elements in our report and determining that they pretty much are I wouldn't say the same, but they're extremely similar and show a lack of progress over 10 years, which is a pretty sustained track record of poor performance. So why did you suddenly, I noticed in the white paper, you really picked apprenticeships as something to focus on. And could you talk a little bit about that and what your thinking was?
Yeah, absolutely. And absolutely, as we've talked about, I echo your frustration that many of these systems have been around for a long time. We've been talking about a number of them for a really long time. But actually implementing them takes political will, takes a moment, takes a catalyst. So why apprenticeships particularly? For one, it allows hiring at entry levels. This is an opportunity to recognize we have junior people that we can bring in who can be to some degree of useful early on in their career, who can stay with us for a certain period of time and gain their experience while they're here. It also, critically, given the unemployment we're seeing as a result of the pandemic, gives an opportunity for those employees to start earning a salary now. If we're recognizing that part of the problem, part of the driver, part of the catalyst is the current unemployment rates, having an opportunity for new employees to start earning that salary really becomes important. Alternatively, you'd be talking about some sort of system where they're going to gain a degree, investing in tuition for a couple of years, 2-4 years down the line. They may get a job, or they may start earning a salary. And that didn't really make sense with the present moment. So that opportunity to really earn while they learn, to be able to dive in and earn a salary that increases with their value to the organization, that increases with their experience level, but to earn something from the outset made a lot of sense. It also, to your prior point, means that the US government can serve as a proof of concept and can put forward a proof of concept that apprenticeships really do work. There's been a lot of talk about this, a lot of interest. There have been legislative proposals. I know the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education has a working group that's entirely dedicated to talking about cybersecurity apprenticeships. And we want to make sure that we're taking that enthusiasm, taking that interest, and giving it an opportunity to really demonstrate the utility.
Thanks. That's excellent. And as you commented as you wrote in the original report, we started out this crisis, with a shortfall between 33 and 35,000, federal IT workforce members. We knew that was the kind of where we sat when the crisis started. I can only imagine how hard the other, 70,000 workers have been working to make up for that shortfall of almost 30%. All right, I'm going to skip over to Rob again and kind of bring up something that I mentioned in my opening comments, but we really haven't dealt with here, and that's the disinformation issue. And so, Rob, disinformation campaigns during the pandemic have been spreading falsehoods about the pandemic, about topics such as the origin of the virus, all the way down to what's the best form of treatment. What has this environment shown you about the efficacy of some of the Commission's original recommendations? And what were the additional recommendations on this topic that you identified to put in the white paper?
Yeah, so disinformation, I think, was one of the most challenging issues that the Commission had to contend with. Our initial recommendations were couched largely in the context of our election security recommendations from the final report, and they focused primarily on building long-term resiliency in the American population to malign foreign influence campaigns. And elections are, frankly, where the vast majority of time, effort, and focus has been when we talk about disinformation campaigns on the sort of preventative side, right? But the pandemic, I think, should really change that, because the COVID-19 pandemic has shown definitively that the disinformation challenge facing the United States today, I think, is much bigger and broader than just elections and campaigns. When adversaries paint a disingenuous picture about the origins or the spread of the disease, to your point, Mark, or about the ways to prevent and treat it, and undermine our confidence in the capacity of the nation, not just the government, but the nation, to respond to it, disinformation is a literal matter of life and death. Against this backdrop, the Commission felt the need to not only recommend stronger civics education and digital literacy efforts, as we did in the initial report, but to also ensure that Americans are equipped with the tools to help them understand, identify, and ultimately counter disinformation as it appears in the ecosystem. The Commission therefore believes that civil society must maintain a robust non-governmental capability to identify disinformation activities and their malign infrastructure. Democratic governments must continue to shun any inclination to become arbiters of truth, to have ministries of truth or anything like that. But it's critical that the US government help ensure that social media companies, other media outlets, civil society, and the general population are able to build sort of expertise and credibility necessary to sound the alarm when disinformation campaigns pose an urgent threat to the American public. We therefore proposed two new recommendations in the white paper. The first is doubling down on a provision in the fiscal year 2020 NDAA, which authorizes the Office of the Director of National Intelligence to establish and fund a social media data and threat analysis center. It's essentially a social media ISAC. The DTAC would take the form of a non-governmental nonprofit organization funded by the US government, but intended to encourage and facilitate public-private cooperation around identifying and countering foreign influence campaigns. However, the Commission also felt that we must do more to elevate ongoing efforts in civil society to identify and highlight disinformation to the public. We therefore, in addition to sort of doubling down on the DTAC, we recommend that Congress fund the Department of Justice, along with in consultation with DHS and the National Science Foundation, to provide grants to existing nonprofit centers that seek to identify, expose, and explain malign foreign influence campaigns to the American public, while also putting those campaigns in context to avoid amplifying them. We think that it's crucial to both sort of have the capability across the U.S. population to be sort of more resilient, to understand civics, to understand digital literacy, in order to be resilient to disinformation campaigns. But also, when we see these sharp spikes, we need capability, and it can't be government capability to really identify and communicate disinformation and malign foreign influence campaigns to the general public. That's why we really think we need to lean in and invest in building greater capacity in civil society there.
Hey, thanks, Rob. So we got two questions right off the bat about the your first recommendation mentioned, the social media data analysis center. I'll answer the first one and then give you the second one. So the first question, Dwight asked, why did the Commission feel it was necessary to recommend the social media data analysis center already passed in last year's NDA? What I'll say is we had failed to really identify that specific solution when we were working through it. And so when the NDA came out pretty late in our process, we just hadn't done work. There were we did have to modify recommendations for the FY20 NDA where, the Senator House staffs, and then as a result, the final product, had some recommendation that was close to one of ours. So we would adjust our recommendation accordingly. But in this one, we just hadn't had it in there. And so we're really going back and saying, hey, we missed this. And this would have, had we thought about things in the pandemic content, we would have probably recommended this. So that's why we brought it in. Second one comes from Michael regarding the social media. So from Michael, regarding that social media ISAC, do you think that these companies will share information with a nonprofit that receives funds from the ODNI? Knowing that building an ISAC takes time, what can be done between now and then and the election, this November on that front? And Rob, I'll pass that to you.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one, Michael, and you know as well as anyone the challenges with building trust in this community. I think that is going to be the primary challenge, and I think that's part of the reason why this is unimplemented right now. I think in order to do so, the ISAC or the DTAC, as it were, is going to need to show that it can provide real, tangible value to social media companies in order for them to really buy in. And you have a bit of a chicken and egg problem. They're going to need some of the information that social media companies hold in order to then turn that around to good analysis that they can hopefully, in coordination with ODNI, pull in sort of robust analysis and help inform when there is some sort of threat on any of these platforms that needs to be addressed. But the trust deficit, I think, is the biggest one. And that's, again, why I think in addition to DTAC, which we do think is a good idea, but faces implementation challenges, we wanted to double down on this recommendation and say, in addition to this sort of government sponsored through ODNI, we need to also lean into existing initiatives that are out there already in civil society, whether it's, things like the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensics Research Laboratory or the Alliance for Security and Democracy, right? And their Hamilton dashboard. There are things that are out there already that do some of this work, and we need to ensure that they have sort of robust capability to not just continue, but potentially expand that work, given the sort of urgency of this challenge.
Thanks. People are putting some stuff in chat. I'd ask they put it in Q&A, but I would say Mike Eisenberg references civics education, and I think we didn't really double tap it. I think Rob may have referred to it, but that was the one strong recommendation that we had on this disinformation in the original report, and I think we do need to double down on it. I'm more convinced. I have an 11th grader and a 12th grader, so I can see the lack of civics education occurring in a high-end public high school. So I'll only say that I agree that there needs to be something on this. So we have a couple of workforce questions coming in, and the first is I'll take, and the second one I'll give to Laura. Someone asked. I think Reed asks, what are folks' thoughts on connecting programs like CTAP to, which is a CISA cybersecurity education training assistance program, to the National Science Foundation Scholarship for Service program, CyberCorps? My answer is that I was involved in the creation of CyberCorps. What I'll say is we did steal aggressively from the other programs. They were interlinked. In other words, NSA was running and still runs a program similar to CyberCorps, and the university's ability to be certified for one usually makes it certified for the other, not completely. But as you go around to the 82 or so universities, colleges, or community colleges that run scholarship for service, you'll find a lot of other government cybersecurity programs running in the back, slightly smaller, usually running in the background. We are all in on scholarship for service. We gave, we noticed this 37,000 person shortfall. We recognize that the federal government's trying to hire 4,000 cybersecurity personnel a year, and a high quality ROTC, and I use that in the sense of we pay you for service, and we pay your undergraduate bills as we do for our military ROTC student, and you owe some time of commitment of service to the federal government. That's the extent of the analogy with ROTC, but the Scholarship for Service program, which in fact gives you more money than a military ROTC because it pays a lot more for room and board. My point on this is that's running right now at about 200 to 300 students a year. We think long-term, we recommended it should run as high as 2,000 per year. Now you can't get there in 1 or 2 years. You're going to have to grow. We made recommendations to appropriations committees for increases of around 20%. And I think if you do that for every other year for a number of years, you can eventually get this program to where it needs to be. And it should rely heavily and be linked heavily to other ongoing cybersecurity workforce and recruitment and retention programs. So that was a long answer to a short question. And there's a second question here. It's for Laura. The annex references hiring authorities for people who aren't U.S. government participants. What's that mean? And what's the problem with the way these hiring authorities are currently working?
Yeah, good question. And I mentioned that earlier too. So thanks for the chance to explain. Government hiring is complicated for really, in many cases, really good reasons. There are specific criteria that need to be met when USG brings a new person on board. So for example, we as a society have decided that veterans will get hiring preference when they come in. That in order to fill certain roles, you need to demonstrate hours of experience of actual work on the job. Job postings need to go to USA Jobs to be posted for a certain period of time. All of these different things fall on a checklist to demonstrate that the hiring process in government is really encapsulating the values that we as a society have decided that we want government hiring to reflect. However, it's also really hard when you're looking for very specific talent. And especially when that talent, as it does in cybersecurity, comes in different ways, that someone's background may not meet any kind of template, that people are often self-taught or taught through non-conventional means. So the sort of conflation of these two things, the system for hiring and then what we need for a cybersecurity workforce and the speed with which we need to be able to hire those people, sets up a situation where it really becomes quite hard to hire people, to bring people into the cybersecurity workforce in government, even more so than it is in other industries. In order to address this, different parts of government have created direct hire authorities, or have been using direct hire authorities, which means that they can pull in a specific person while sort of reworking some of those requirements. So say, for example, DoD will evaluate how you are looking at veterans preference after the most competent candidates have been selected. So we'll evaluate the candidates and then see if someone gets a veterans bonus, so that we're making sure that hiring managers are really seeing all the candidates that they need to be seeing. So by reworking some of those systems, you can come up with more efficient ways to get people in the door. These hiring authorities exist in some places in government, but not others. So for example, I mentioned DoD, they have the Cyber Accepted Service. They also have Schedule A hiring authorities, similar things that allow people to come in and do the job right off the bat. But not all departments and agencies have these. And a lot of times, even when they do exist, they're not used very often. That's often because there's just unfamiliarity with the system, that HR teams don't really know, why are we using this? What is it for? How do we use it? They're oftentimes complex because it's government processes. And they also are complicated to work with because hiring through direct hire authorities often means that someone enters a different career track within the federal government. They're no longer in the competitive service, which has implications for retirement benefits, for how they are promoted, how they run through pay scales. And all of that just becomes really complicated. So having this diffuse system that differs by agency really creates a lot of complexities and difficulty in bringing in the right people.
Thanks, Laura. I've got a two-part question here from Bob Butler that I'll try to take. Gratified by the recommendation for state grants associated with IT modernization. Will the effort be picked up by the Congress? Which committee will work it? Secondly, these dollars are stimulus. These dollars are likely stimulus. What is the commission's sense on how states will sustain? And then what is the commission's sense on how states will sustain? Finally, what will be required of the states to ensure that federal monies are used most effectively? So what we attempted to do, and we have not been successful yet, we've written proposed legislation to go in whenever we see this IT modernization legislation get into, say, COVID recovery packages or stimulus packages, is to write in a requirement for cybersecurity. And what we're really doing is writing in a requirement for lifecycle maintenance, because we agree with you. If you give, we'll just say $10 to a state or locality, and they spend all 10 on procurement of hardware, software, and particularly on hardware, and don't spend any of it on the management and lifecycle maintenance of that, the next year when there's no stimulus package, the state and local is going to have to make a decision. And I know, because state and locals have this nasty problem of having to have a balanced budget for the most part, not always in their retirement accounts, but certainly in everything else. And that has an extremely negative impact on cybersecurity historically. Cybersecurity is one of those things, along with a few other programs inside the state and local budgets, that tend to get hammered when they're in a budget crunch situation. So if you're providing something in stimulus in a one-off account, you have to be extremely sensitive to accounting for life cycle maintenance. And so we try to put some language in there to do it. So far, we've been unsuccessful. We'll keep doing it and keep working it. And we have supporters on both sides of the aisle in both chambers on this. So I'm comfortable we'll eventually get there. It's a logical thing. I mean, there's a general, this isn't true for every industry, it varies in there, but when you're spending X amount of money on IT programs, you should spend about 8 to 12% on IT security. And what we historically see is 2 to 3%. And what could happen in some of these stimulus packages is close to zero if you're not careful. So, Bob, your point's well taken, and we'll be working it. But we're just, when I say we, I mean the members of the commission who are current serving representatives, either current serving congressmen, either representatives or senators. Then here's the next part of the question. Here's the next question for Rob, and it's on disinformation.
Mark, could I actually jump in? Could I jump in on that last one really quickly? Just Just a couple things to add. I think you hit the nail on the head, and we're looking, and as Mark mentioned, we're looking at different ways that we can sort of ensure that states then maintain their budget. And a couple of ways that we think about doing that. One is a requirement for putting a certain portion of the funds that are received from the grant and from the matching, which for the second grant at least we would require from states. Into a working capital fund for continued maintenance and continuity. The other is a clause that we're trying to get in there that requires grantees to maintain their existing level of IT spending by percentage, in addition to the grants funding, which we think will help sort of flatten that out and enable them to maintain a certain level of funding. In terms of like how we ensure that they will be investing in secure services, we're talking about placing a couple of requirements in there, which will be essentially identified by CISA. They'll have to provide some sort of guidance on the sort of level of security required for products and services that are procured by these grants. And then they would be in a position to approve procurement. And then in addition, the final piece that we think helps sort of put the final sort of nail in the coffin, or not really a nail in the coffin, but sort of instill the importance of security here, is that we ask for the affirmation of the role of the state CIO, and that the state CIO is left to manage the grant itself.
Thanks. That was a much more detailed answer from mine. I'm glad you jumped in. So back at you, Rob, though, with this, it's question on from Sandra. How would you ensure that the efforts to counter disinformation do not become a political issue? And I'll give you a second one with that. Why, from an email, why establish a separate DTAC under ODNI?
Yeah, so I think the first one is the most challenging question I think we face as a society writ large, and I'm not sure that I have all of the answers for you, but this is one of the major reasons why we think you need to push any and all capability you can in order to identify and counter disinformation out of government and into ideally nonprofit organizations that are there sort of already established in civil society and have a certain level of trust from the broader sort of American population, and that the best way to really maintain it as a non-political issue is to push push the capability out to the edges, frankly, and hopefully by sort of through strength of numbers we're able to sort of flatten out the political aspects of it. But I mean, Sandra, you're absolutely right that anything that can be politicized on the information front seems to be these days, and it's an uphill battle to try to address that. The second question, which was on why the creation of DTAC under ODNI versus sort of more of an integrating function. I think the idea with DTAC, at least as it's written in the NDAA, is that it would actually serve that integration function. I think it's valid to sort of say why ODNI. I think that a lot of the capability, to the point of the person who asked the question, I think Emil, sits across different departments and agencies. But at the end of the day, we basically looked at it and said, why reinvent the wheel? This is a method and a vehicle that's already there. It seems like a good idea to have this sort of integration and coordination capability. So let's double down on that.
Thanks. And there's a question here on CTAP authorization. I can't speak to that exactly. I can say that I looked at our appropriations requests for cyber education and awareness, and we recommend a $5 million increase in cyber education awareness at CISA and about an $18 million increase in Department of Education civics education efforts. And that was obviously before we had to submit those back in March to support appropriations timeline. So that was pre the pandemic crisis per se, or everything we learned from that. So we'll see how those float. They have to compete in a very fulsome environment of appropriations requests and increases, although they were provided by our members, directly into the effort. So we'll see what happens. I have a long question here from Lori. Even the best models show that it would be economically difficult to build full chain of critical infrastructure, 5G medical, I think that's full supply chain of critical infrastructure without involving international partners and vendors. What do you see as reasonable levels of requirements imposed to non-US partners for them not to be influenced by potentially adversarial nations? first, I want to make clear we agree with you completely. And when we look at these, when you look at, say, IT hardware, and you say there's 12 or 13 different types of IT hardware out there generically, and the United States is a consumer of 30 to 40% of most of them, but a producer of 0 to 10% of all of them, and with one exception in some foundry microchips issues. But what I'd say is, clearly there's a gap there, and that gap can be filled to some degree by allies, treaty allies with which you have very significant ties and information intelligence sharing relationships, and then some partners, say Scandinavian partners in Sweden and Finland, and then and as I said, allies like Japan, Korea, and then there's partners like Taiwan. And so I think that's really what we're getting at. Probably one of the most critical questions we have facing us, and we're studying this as a commission right now, is what does it mean to have a secure supply chain through Taiwan? And there's a reason. The final option after this, unstated, is China, and I'm pretty sure most of us would find that less credible than any of the other supply chains I just mentioned. So, given that, we do have to figure this out, and this is an interesting confluence of events, because there's a lot of other reasons Taiwan is an interesting part. The status of the relationship with Taiwan is interesting. So we are looking at that. I'll pass the more detailed part of this to Rob, see if he can talk about what some of the if there are any specific issues or requirements that can be imposed to not be influenced. Rob?
I mean, honestly, Mark, I think you hit the nail on the head. And I would say that this is an issue that merits a great deal of further investigation, whether it's by this commission or another. I think that the supply chain issue that we're facing right now, especially when it comes to sort of the ability of supply chain compromise, not only to cause disruption in the midst of a crisis, but actually to be the root cause of the crisis itself, I think is not necessarily fully understood. And especially from the U.S. perspective, we're slowly beginning to come around to the notion that supply chain compromise poses a major risk, not only to sort of USG and the military, but to our broader economy. I don't know that we necessarily have the answers to sort of what requirements need to be placed on partner nations in order to ensure that they are sort of trustworthy. But I think the goal is definitely to build a trustworthy group of partner nations that allows us to have that sort of trusted supply chain that doesn't necessarily need to rely on countries or companies in countries who we might be adversarial with now or in the future.
So I think we have time for one last question we have here. It has to do on one of the recommendations from one of our new recommendations. Rob, could you elaborate a little bit on what the Internet of Things security law is like, would do, and is it similar to any existing congressional recommendations out there? I added that last part on myself, but if you could go ahead and comment on that a little bit, that'll be our final question.
Yeah, sure. So the IoT law, we're in the process now of drafting the actual legislative proposal, which is where the rubber really meets the road. But what we're striving for with this recommendation is some pretty baseline security requirements for IoT products and services. And we want to start by focusing initially just on routers, because we know that that's a massive problem. But some baseline security requirements that would, again, just require unique authentication by default, but then also new authentication once an IoT device is plugged into a network. And the second big one is requiring that a device is capable of receiving a remote software update. Right now, a lot of IoT devices are just shipped without either of those things in mind, and that's obviously causing massive issues, from things like the Mirai botnet that we saw to sort of more surgical intrusions that are more targeted and able to exploit, whether it's a router vulnerability or a sort of smart bulb vulnerability. And the goal there is really to raise all boats, raise the tide to raise all boats. And to Mark's question and Mark's point, there is an existing proposal. I think it's just called the Cybersecurity Improvement Act of 2019, which basically does the same thing that we're trying to shoot for, but just for U.S. government procurement. And what we're suggesting is we take that base text as sort of a starting point. We look at other models that are out there. The UK and Europe have been working on things. California has an IoT security law. take a look at these existing models and we decide sort of where the balance point is, because as with all of our recommendations that are a little bit paternalistic in nature, and I would argue that actually we've done a pretty good job, not just in this white paper, but in the report writ large, of staying away from overly paternalistic approaches. But with all of the recommendations that are a little paternalistic, we wanted to stay away from being overly prescriptive. We wanted to set the requirements as sort of baseline as possible, because we know that even that small incremental change will make a huge difference for the ecosystem as a whole.
Thanks, Rob. So that was great. We're just getting near the top of the hour here. I want to, you can see why it's a real pleasure to lead this commission, to have three really intelligent, well-spoken senior staffers here able to explain the pandemic annex. If you have follow-up questions, just you can hit us up through solarium.gov. The report itself is the pandemic, the white paper is posted on solarium.gov. And you should be able to access it there. So I want to wrap up by thanking everyone who attended. We had a pretty high attendance today. I want to give you a heads up that regarding the next event, we've been doing this weekly. We're going to take 1 week off. We'll be back in 2 weeks. And then over the next few weeks after that, we're going to talk about workforce, some elements of Defend Forward, and supply chain, kind of three more discussion points that we've worked on. But the next one isn't for about 2 weeks from now. So thank you all very much. Diane, anything I missed?
Can you guys hear me? Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining. As I mentioned before, the full pandemic white paper can be found on our website at www.solarium.gov. I pasted a link in the chat if anyone's checking that. The recording will also be made available on our website. So if you want to check it out tomorrow, feel free to do so. And that's it. Very much for joining, and look forward to seeing you for the next one.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.